We move on now to Progressive Era Part 3. We're ready for the difference between urban progressives and social justice progressives. This is the main place where you find them kind of working at cross purposes. They don't realize they are, but from a distance you can see it pretty plainly. The first progressives were urban progressives. Okay, these were middle class residents of cities who did not approve of the way big cities were being run. The machine politics, boss rule, corruption, it seemed to be very inefficient. It existed for the purpose of enriching dishonest people who were either politicians or worked from behind the scenes. So your typical urban progressive wants to reimagine city government. And the ideal was to make city government run like a business. Businesses seem to be efficient and smooth. Why don't we do that? Of course, these urban progressives often were businessmen themselves. So they eventually succeeded. One boost for them came out of the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. On September 8th, 1900, a vicious hurricane struck Galveston, Texas, which at the time was built on a sandbar and was totally defenseless. At the time, it was the largest city in the state of Texas, and the death toll is loosely reckoned at around 6,000. The professional weather guys, I'm off the subject in a way, they didn't think hurricanes could come that far east. Well, yeah. Anyway, the state government, and some have argued since this was completely unnecessary, simply moved in and set aside the existing city government in that city and imposed on it a commission form of government, as it's called, where you have a commissioner of this and a commissioner of that, and these are paid professionals. So that seemed to work well as Galveston was rebuilt, and it came to be widely adopted in cities across the country. You would also have a kind of a middle course that would be steered called the council manager form of government, where the city council and the mayor are democratically elected, and what they do is simply set policy. The policies are then implemented by a professional, a hired professional who would bear the title of city manager. And you would have like a police commissioner and a fire commissioner and that sort of thing. So that resembled the commissioner form of government. Well, those were the urban progressives, and what they're doing here is going to make city government less democratic, because boss rule ran on democracy. Boss rule was thoroughly corrupt, but the way they stayed in power was by meeting the human needs of working class people in the cities. Okay, social justice progressives are a little harder to define. They run the gamut from being temperance advocates, people who want to persuade people not to drink so much alcohol, which then morphs into a prohibition movement, which wants to outlaw it altogether, and pretty much succeeded. You have people who want to improve conditions for the working poor. You have progressives mainly in the medical profession who want to improve health conditions. Okay, you have people who they are unfamiliar with the concept of personal hygiene. They don't even know to wash their hands. They don't know there might be a problem drinking water from the river, in the big cities, we're all on rivers or coastlines, that's downstream from where the sewers just flow into the river. So you have that. So, and a lot of different specific variations of it. There was something called the settlement house movement, where usually young, middle-aged, idealistic kids fresh out of college would simply live among the urban poor in a settlement house. The most famous was called Hull House. It was an old rundown mansion in Chicago, and it was there for nearly 50 years. And these young middle class people was run by a woman named Jane Addams, Adams with two D's, and she lived till 1946. But they would be there to just help these people with any problems they might have, teach them habits of hygiene, punctuality, thrift, all this. And basically, it was assumed that the way you help poor people is by addressing their habits that keep them from succeeding. Okay, that would be uh, alcohol abuse, poor hygiene, um, lack of habits of thrift and punctuality and such as that. You're going to do better if you got that. So I always kind of looked askance at people who criticized folks who wanted to teach that. But the social justice progressives pretty much uniformly wanted to make government more democratic, not less. Okay? But that was mainly at the state government level. All right? Social justice progressives did not have a lot of faith in representative governments. They have a state legislature. A lot of states don't pay their legislators very much. Texas was notorious for that. I mean, substitute teachers would make more money than a member of the Texas legislature. That might still be true. The real reason for that was to reserve this for people of means, of independent means. Only wealthy people could afford a job like that. And the voters would enthusiastically help them by thinking it was going to bankrupt the state if you raised the pay a little bit. But what the progressives want to do is go around representative government by bringing in elements of direct democracy to replace representative democracy, which can't be trusted because the wealthy businessmen could simply bribe or buy off members of the legislature. Okay, as I've said at the beginning of the 20th century, there were several corporations, major corporations, which were monopolistic trusts with annual revenues, each one with annual revenues in excess of the revenues of the federal government itself. So, yeah, and you can't say this isn't going on now. In a way, Congress today is squeaky clean because it's too hard to get away with, but somehow people of ordinary means get elected to the House of Representatives, and then when they finally retire or get ousted years later, they are independently wealthy. How does that happen? Would they like to answer questions about that? Would they want their tax returns made public like they want the president's made public? Well, anyway. So, the main means of introducing direct democracy that was most widely adopted, Texas does not have it, is a process known as initiative and referendum, a two-part process. This is where the voters can either directly enact a law without going to the legislature or present the legislature with a law approved by the public, which they then have to vote on as is, and they can't, mess it up. So you'd circulate a petition, which is the text of the proposed law. If it gets enough signatures and it goes on the ballot at the next election as a referendum, if more people vote for it than vote against it, typically it then goes to the state legislature and they have to vote on it as is. And the vote has to be recorded. So the voters out there know who was for it, who's against it. Initiative and referendum. Again, Texas has never had that. Another one was recall. That's where if you got an elected official, like, somebody high profile like a governor, if they'd screw up bad enough, voters could circulate a petition to recall that person. In other words, they would have to face the voters who would go to the polls and decide whether they get to finish their term. And this has happened in fairly recent times, okay, in a couple of states. And in some states, they just decide if they vote the governor out or whoever it is, then whoever is next in line steps up. There are other states where other people can file, run against the governor in a recall. It's hard to generalize about that. But some years ago, the governor of California survived a recall election. And then there was a governor of Illinois who was actually soliciting bribes to appoint somebody to the Senate seat vacated by Barack Obama when he won the presidency. And he got impeached and convicted and removed and went to federal prison. Um, President Trump recently pardoned him. I'm not sure why, but he was grateful. Uh, so, and the list goes on. You have, and Texas does not have recall either. There was direct election of U.S. senators. In the original Constitution, senators were not democratically elected. They were chosen by the legislatures of the states because they represented the states as equal political entities. And the Constitution was amended in 1913. I believe this was the 17th Amendment, to make it more, democratic, where the voters can choose United States senators, which they still can. And people may not understand that they represent the states as equal entities. That's why California, which has more people than Canada does, has 2 senators, and Wyoming, which has fewer people than the city of Fort Worth, has 2 senators. Okay. So social justice progressives worked for democracy. Now, sometimes progressivism was a middle class versus working class conflict. Working class people weren't usually happy about these do-gooders from the middle class trying to get them to change their lifestyle. Those who wanted to limit or eliminate alcohol sales, what does that look like to a factory worker whose life is extremely dull and drab and harsh? You're asking him to give up. And by the way, this is not the women, because saloons were typically men only. Women were either not allowed or would not choose to enter a saloon. Well, that's the one bright spot in his life. His little stop by the saloon on the way home. There isn't anything else. Have a few drinks and forget the harsh reality of life. So, working class people tended to be the unwilling objects of these changes. Okay, where are we here? This next thing could show up as a possible essay question, and that's the difference between progressives as defined then and socialists. Okay, we've talked quite a bit about the progressives already. These tend to be middle class people who are trying to preserve the existing system by smoothing off the rough edges and making really radical solutions like socialism seem less attractive. So, and we've been over them. So socialism is being talked about a lot today. So we'll look at that. And if I run out of time, I'll just bridge it over into the next thing. I got about 2 minutes before I have to do that. I think a lot of people today who say they support socialism, and the number of people, according to polling, that favor socialism is frighteningly high. I happen to have been raised during the Cold War, and people of my era take a very different view of that. So I think a lot of people who think they favor socialism don't really have a clear idea of what it actually is and what it would actually become. So I'll go ahead and clue you in. I am not a fan. Oh my, that's good. In socialism, the government would either confiscate or buy out the major means of production. Okay? Agriculture would become a government project, manufacturing, the transportations, the utilities, the banks. Technically, the socialist would insist those are owned collectively by the people at large and managed on their behalf by the state. Okay? Just having high taxes, I'm going to quote Bernie Sanders, he would tax the hell out of the rich, which tells me he has no clue how an economy really works or who the rich are. He doesn't even know that. Just having high taxes in a nanny state, that doesn't make you socialism. They say, well, look at Denmark, look at Sweden. Those are not socialist countries because the big businesses are privately owned. That's the definition. I will have to come back and pick up on this in Progressive Era, Part 4.